When the Bell P-39 Airacobra first rolled onto American airfields in 1941, many young pilots expected a miracle machine. It looked modern, even exotic, a mid-engine fighter with tricycle landing gear and a 37mm cannon in its nose. But the excitement faded the moment they took it into the sky. American test pilots quickly discovered the first problem. The P-39 couldn't breathe at high altitude. Without a turbo-supercharger, its engine lost power the higher it climbed. At 25,000 feet, where most air combat was expected to happen, the Airacobra felt sluggish, unresponsive, and vulnerable. Many pilots joked that if they met a Messerschmitt Bf 109 above the clouds, all they could do was pray. These weren't just complaints, they were real operational problems. In early training units, instructors watched as new pilots struggled to handle the plane during steep climbs. Some aircraft stalled during sharp turns, others spun unexpectedly. The Airacobra's mid-engine design made it unfamiliar and intimidating. Rumors spread quickly. This thing wants to kill you before you even meet the enemy. By mid-1942, the P-39 had earned a brutal nickname in U.S. squadrons: the worst fighter America ever built. In the Pacific, things didn't get any better. P-39 units defending New Guinea reported they were constantly ambushed by Japanese Zero fighters at higher altitude. American pilots complained that they could never choose the terms of the fight. The Zero could dive, climb, or escape at will. Many missions ended with frustrated radio calls from Airacobra pilots who simply couldn't get their aircraft to reach the enemy in time. Mechanics were no more optimistic. The Allison engine overheated easily, and the nose-mounted cannon jammed often. Some ground crews said they spent more time apologizing to pilots than fixing the machines. Eventually, the U.S. Army Air Forces began removing the P-39 from frontline duty. More powerful designs, the P-38, P-47, and P-51, were arriving, and compared to them, the Airacobra looked hopelessly outdated. To most American commanders, the P-39 was a failed experiment, a fighter that didn't fit the altitude requirements of modern aerial warfare. But while the Airacobra was being pushed aside in the U.S., another nation looked at it with entirely different eyes. And soon, the aircraft America hated would become one of the deadliest weapons on the Eastern Front. When the United States decided the P-39 Airacobra was no longer suitable for frontline combat, hundreds of aircraft sat idle in storage depots. But far away on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was fighting a completely different kind of air war, one fought at low altitude, where speed, firepower, and toughness mattered more than high-altitude performance. And suddenly, the fighter nobody in America wanted became a perfect match. The first batches of P-39s arrived in the USSR through the Alaska-Siberia ferry route in 1942. Soviet pilots were skeptical at first. They had seen many Western aircraft that promised much on paper but fell short in the brutal, close-range battles over the front lines. Yet the moment they tested the Airacobra at low altitude, their doubts evaporated. The Allison engine, weak at high altitude, delivered incredible acceleration near the ground. Soviet pilots immediately noticed how quickly the P-39 could dive, roll, and recover. Its weight distribution made it stable during tight turns, and that 37mm cannon, the same one American mechanics complained about, suddenly became a devastating advantage. One pilot described his first test flight simply, "This machine hits like a hammer." Unlike American units, the Soviets did not try to climb above the clouds. Their battles were fought at 500 to 3,000 meters, right where the Airacobra performed best. And while American pilots hated the cockpit layout, Soviet pilots loved it. The visibility was excellent, the landing gear made rough airfields safer, and the radio equipment, although simple, was still better than what many Soviet fighters carried at the time. But the real key to the P-39's success in Soviet hands was discipline and adaptation. Soviet mechanics learned how to maintain the cannon properly, reducing the jamming that plagued American crews. They fine-tuned the engines and replaced unreliable components. Even ammunition belts were reorganized to improve feeding into the cannon. Soon, Soviet regiments began requesting more Airacobras by name. By 1943, some of the Red Air Force's most elite units were flying P-39s. They discovered that the aircraft excelled at ambush tactics, quick climbs to intercept German bombers, and deadly low-level dogfights. Luftwaffe pilots who once mocked the Airacobra suddenly found themselves facing Soviet aces hitting them with precise cannon bursts. For the Soviets, the P-39 wasn't a disappointment. It was a workhorse, a reliable, rugged machine that fit their battlefield reality perfectly. The fighter America misunderstood became one of the USSR's most valued weapons. And soon, some Soviet pilots would go on to score dozens, even hundreds, of victories in an aircraft the US declared a failure. On the Eastern Front, the first full month of combat with the P-39 revealed something American commanders had never noticed. The Airacobra, dismissed in the West as sluggish and unreliable, became a completely different creature at low altitude, powerful, responsive, and deadly. Soviet pilots quickly realized they weren't flying a failed fighter. They were flying a beast built for their style of war. The revelation came during routine interceptions near Stalingrad in early 1943. A Soviet squadron flying P-39s scrambled to stop a group of German Ju-88 bombers escorted by Bf-109s. The Airacobras didn't try to climb to meet them. Instead, they attacked from below, accelerating with a punch the Soviets hadn't felt in other Western aircraft. One pilot described the experience later. "It felt like the aircraft leapt forward the moment I pushed the throttle. While the Germans expected a slow, predictable enemy, the P-39 tore through their formation. Its incredible roll rate allowed pilots to shift targets quickly, while the mid-engine design kept the aircraft stable even during violent maneuvers. At low altitude, the Allison engine delivered its full potential, raw horsepower that translated into blistering speed in level flight. What shocked the Germans most was the cannon. The 37mm gun that Americans complained about suddenly became the star of the battlefield. A single well-placed shot could snap the wing off a bomber or punch through the engine block of a Bf-109. Luftwaffe crews soon learned to fear the sound of that heavy shell being fired. It wasn't subtle, it was a thunderclap. Soviet pilots began developing new tactics built entirely around the P-39's strengths. Instead of climbing spirals, they used low-level slashing attacks. Instead of slow dogfights at altitude, they relied on surprise, acceleration, and sheer firepower. The Airacobra's unique balance allowed pilots to execute tight turns without stalling, an advantage in the chaotic, smoke-filled skies above the front lines. Mechanics helped unlock even more of the plane's hidden potential. They reinforced landing gear for rough field takeoffs, fine-tuned the engine cooling systems, and kept the cannon clean and reliable. Every improvement made the aircraft more suited to harsh Soviet conditions. Soon, regiments reported that the P-39 required less maintenance than many native Soviet fighters. Word spread quickly. Young pilots arriving at training bases asked specifically to be assigned to Airacobra units. They had heard stories of aces scoring multiple kills in a single day, of German pilots misjudging the P-39 and paying the price, of a Western reject becoming an Eastern legend. By mid-1943, the Soviet High Command knew the truth. The P-39 was not a flawed fighter. It was a hidden weapon, misunderstood by the nation that built it but perfectly adapted for the war it was now fighting. On paper, the Airacobra was mediocre, but in the hands of Soviet pilots, flying low over the forests and battlefields of the Eastern Front, it became something else entirely, a brutal, unstoppable machine designed for victory. By 1943, the P-39 Airacobra had transformed from a rejected American fighter into one of the Soviet Union's most prized weapons. But its success didn't come from the aircraft alone. It came from the men who flew it. On the Eastern Front, a new generation of Soviet aces discovered that the Airacobra was not just effective but deadly in the right hands. Their skill, creativity, and fearlessness would turn the P-39 into a legend. One of the first to unlock the aircraft's potential was Alexander Pokryshkin, a name that became synonymous with mastery of the Airacobra. Pokryshkin developed strict tactical rules that every pilot in his regiment followed. His most famous principle: altitude, speed, maneuver, fire, fit the P-39 perfectly. The aircraft responded instantly to control input, allowing Pokryshkin to perform high-speed slashing attacks that caught German pilots completely off guard. He used the 37mm cannon with surgical precision, striking from unexpected angles, often destroying his target with a single shot. Pokryshkin's squadron soon became one of the most feared units on the front. German reports described encounters with unusually aggressive American-built fighters. They had no idea that these machines were being flown by the most tactically advanced aces in the Red Air Force. Another rising star was Grigory Rechkalov, a quiet and methodical pilot whose calm aggression made him incredibly dangerous in battle. Rechkalov's technique was simple: get close, fire once, and disappear before the enemy knew what happened. He preferred low-level fights where the P-39 stability gave him an edge. His precision earned him dozens of victories, many achieved in rapid succession during chaotic dogfights. He and Pokryshkin together became one of the deadliest duos of the entire war. The Airacobra also attracted pilots who weren't aces yet, but became aces because of it. Nikolai Gulaev, for example, arrived with raw talent but little experience. In the P-39, he found a machine that amplified his natural aggressiveness. Gulaev attacked head-on, a maneuver most pilots avoided, but the P-39's heavy cannon made this style terrifyingly effective. His bold tactics earned him victories at a pace that stunned even veteran commanders. Behind these heroes stood dozens of lesser-known but equally skilled pilots who made the Airacobra their own. They learned to fight at treetop height, using the landscape to mask their approach. They worked closely with ground forces, striking German armor and supply convoys with ruthless accuracy. Every pilot shared stories of moments when the Airacobra's speed saved their life, or when its cannon ended a duel before it even began. German pilots soon recognized the shape of the P-39 in the distance and treated it with caution. They had expected an outdated American fighter. Instead, they found themselves facing men who had turned it into a precision weapon. Many Luftwaffe veterans later admitted that Soviet P-39 regiments were among the most formidable opponents they encountered. By the end of the war, Soviet pilots flying P-39s scored more than 2,400 confirmed kills, a record unmatched by the aircraft in any other theater of war. The aces of the Eastern Front didn't just save the Airacobra's reputation. They rewrote its legacy forever. By the end of World War II, the story of the P-39 Airacobra had become one of the strangest and most dramatic reversals in aviation history. It entered the war as a disappointment, an American fighter mocked by its own pilots, grounded by its limitations, and overshadowed by sleeker, faster aircraft. Yet it emerged from the Eastern Front as a symbol of triumph, a machine that delivered more than 2,400 confirmed kills and helped forge some of the greatest aces the world had ever seen. Its redemption was not an accident. It was the result of perfect circumstances, brilliant pilots, and a war that demanded something very different from what America expected. The transformation began the moment the P-39 left the Western theater. In the United States, it had been judged by how high it could climb. But in the Soviet Union, altitude didn't matter. Battles were fought low, between 500 and 3,000 meters, exactly where the P-39 performed best. What Americans saw as a flaw, Soviet pilots saw as a gift. The Allison engine delivered explosive acceleration near the ground, and the mid-engine layout gave the aircraft a stability that made it perfect for tight, violent turning fights. Most importantly, the Airacobra carried a weapon unlike anything the Germans expected: a 37mm cannon that could rip a bomber apart or punch through a fighter with a single shot. For Soviet pilots, this wasn't a gimmick. It was a decisive advantage. They learned to fire it at the perfect moment, often ending dogfights before they had truly begun. But the aircraft alone wasn't enough. Its redemption came from the men who mastered it. Pokryshkin with his innovative tactics, Rechkalov with his sniper-like precision, and dozens of other Soviet aces brought out strengths the Americans never discovered. They didn't treat the P-39 as a flawed experiment. They treated it as a tool, one that, if used properly, could dominate the battlefield. The Germans felt this change almost immediately. Luftwaffe pilots who once mocked the Airacobra soon realized they were facing something dangerous. Reports from the Eastern Front described aggressive American fighters diving out of the sun, firing a single devastating burst, then disappearing behind the tree line. For many German crews, the sight of an Airacobra meant trouble. Its pilots were disciplined, fearless, and incredibly skilled. Back in the United States, the reputation of the P-39 slowly began to change as news trickled in from the East. American officers were stunned to learn that the Soviets, flying the same fighter they had rejected, were achieving extraordinary kill ratios. At first, some dismissed the claims, but the numbers kept growing. By the end of the war, it was undeniable. The worst fighter America ever built had become one of the deadliest on the entire Eastern Front. The P-39's redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about purpose. It found the environment where its strengths mattered and its weaknesses didn't. It found pilots who understood exactly how to use it. And it found a battlefield where brute power, low-altitude agility, and ruthless firepower were the keys to survival. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Airacobra left behind a legacy no one had predicted. It was no longer a failed experiment. It was a killer icon, a machine that proved reputations can be wrong, and that even the most underestimated weapons can become legends in the right hands.